Welcome to everybody to this week's KCOR Zoom presentation by Charles Hill. Charles spoke to us last year about limits to growth at 50. So we may all expect a wonderful presentation again this afternoon. Charles has had a long and distinguished academic career. One of the things that most of us know, including our last week's speaker, John Meyer, used the invention he made early in his career of an energy return on energy invested. So Charles, we're looking forward to hearing from you. Please take over.
It's a good start. I got a coughing fit from an almond I ate. Okay. I want to do two things in this talk. One, I want to have a very general introduction to the role of energy in human affairs, in taking somewhat the long view, but then I want to focus in on the issue of oil, which is our most important energy resource, in many respects, material resource, other than, the sun and food, and introduce a new study that I took part in, because it's quite amazing the degree to which the official estimates and the official discourse around oil is inaccurate. And I wrote an editorial a while ago called "In Defense of Oil." Now everybody talks about how bad oil is, produces CO2 and spills in the ocean and does other bad things, and all that certainly is true. But it has also become an essential resource in many ways for society, and I want to talk about that a bit. So let's go. I want to talk about, first of all, set the stage, sustainability. There's a very sloppy use of the word sustainable. And when I first was thinking about sustainability, I was very confused. And a lot of my confusion was put to rest or was explained by a paper by Goodland and Herman Daly. And they said that sustainability means at least three things to at least three different groups. Economic, with the survival of an economy, sometimes of a not mainstream group of people, or maybe the economy that we live in. Two, social is the survival of an ethnic group or its culture. Three is environmental, survival of nature or a part of nature, or of nature as an important part of our own society. And so the thing that they said is that these are used by different subgroups of people, and often they're at odds with each other. So what we have to be very careful when we talk about sustainability, and I want to say that one of the most essential aspects of sustainability is sufficient energy to support the number of people that you have, at least at some level that is required for the society in which they live. Not necessarily all of the affluence we have, but and to do that, we need, at least today, and for the foreseeable future, we need oil. And by oil, I mean, I perhaps should say petroleum, which is oil and gas. When I first started studying this stuff, fossil fuels provided 81 or 2% of the energy that humans use. And now 50 years later, it's the same. It's 80%. So if we are to make some transition to something else, PV or wind turbines or something, that's going to take an enormous amount of oil. And people in Spain, Capella and Perez, etc., have analyzed that. Okay. Now, all energy, therefore, is humanity's critical resource. It's critical, perhaps, not just because it's one of the 4 or 5 most fundamental resources that we need, but because it's the one that's most in danger of not being there. Now, the importance of energy for humans goes way, way back. So here are these footprints that these anthropologists or paleontologists in Tanzania and Africa found, and this goes on for long period where you have these footprints of, and they're very obviously humans. You can see the toes on them on that 3rd or 4th footprint there. And it's a couple of people. Now, it's been variously indicated as perhaps, let's look at the next slide, is, you know, a group of people going along, or it's also been interpreted as a larger person with his arm around a smaller person. I mean, it was possibly our grandparents on a date, I don't know. But here's a reconstruction of what it might have looked back then. And these people needed energy too. And they needed energy, first of all, they needed food energy, obviously. Next, but here are some modern Kung people, and you see that they have spears and arrows as amongst their most prized possessions. And what does that have to do with energy? Well, let's, and here's a bow. So let's take a look at the next slide, which is this is where the Kung live in Southern Africa. And what they do is they move from water hole to water hole. And the men hunt, and the woman gather mongongo nuts. And I looked at this diagram. I was fascinated by this diagram when I was in graduate school. This is work by Lee, because if they have to live near a water hole, and they go from water hole to water hole to water hole. Next, and when they this is the round trip distance that the woman and children make gathering mongongo nuts. And when they get 10 miles or 5 miles away from their water hole, so they deplete the mongongo nuts as they gather them day after day. They have to make an overnight trip to get the next batch of mongongo nuts, which have been accumulating in their absence. And the cost, the energy cost goes way up. And this probably was the trigger for my own minor claim to fame, which is energy return on investment. That the energy investment is much larger when they go to the next, when they've depleted all of the nuts in the immediate vicinity of their water hole. And then when they've depleted all of them within 2 days walk, then they have to move to another water hole, which they do. So their energy costs of gathering energy is a critical factor to these modern day hunter-gatherers. Next, so we can look at all kinds of things that humans do, as in this cartoon, fire, which Mr. Wilson has got in his hand, is obviously an energy source, and the importance of fire was it allowed humans to eat plants, because plants have cell walls, and by cooking their food, you could do the pre-digestion that allowed people a much wider range of plants to eat. And even a spear point is an energy device. It's a force concentrating device that allowed the Wilsons to kill large animals with the spear. So human evolution, human cultural evolution has always been about expanding our energy resources to get more energy to do whatever it is that we're going to do. Obviously, the evolution of agriculture increased the energy return on energy invested, or EROI, and allowed the development of cities. They were very abundant in Central America. There were, if you look at the landscape, there are mounds covered with trees all over the place. There were once ancient cities. And this was a huge area with enough surplus energy to allow the construction of these very elaborate cities. And of course, in Mesopotamia and other parts of the world, agriculture took off and allowed this. Next. And here is a famous picture of Malay, the gleaners. Agriculture production was so large that even the leftovers could be gathered and support a whole other group of people. An important aspect of this, of course, was the use of draft animals, which greatly increased the power. Power was important, that is the rate of energy per unit time, because if you could prepare your fields at the right time, the exact right week of the year, if you could get all your plants in at that time, this allowed much higher yields and allowed people to get very high yields, which was then turned into more people. Next. Now, the big one is fossil fuels, or, well, which is ancient stored sunlight. And this is the long view of how many people there were on Earth. There weren't a billion until 1850 or something. And then with the Industrial Revolution, the Haber process, by which we could make nitrogen fertilizer, and the technologies that went along with this, our population has increased enormously. And we've seen nothing like that. Now, obviously, I don't think this is a good thing, but it's reality. It's what it is. And the other thing that interests me is that the world economy, the GDP, is indicated in the dashed line on the left here. I'm sorry, on the right. And the gray is the use of coal. The brown is the use of oil. The green is the use of gas. Nuclear is purple, hydro, and you can barely see the yellow up there, which is the other. So now that modern renewables are just 4% or so of the energy used in the world, the industrial energy, obviously the solar energy is still running photosynthesis. And so these two things, the number of us and our economy, are very, very dependent upon our use of fossil fuels. And fossil fuel in agriculture is especially important. Now, just to give you an idea how to visualize this, I stole these pictures from Mario Pietro, but here is a harvester at the turn of the last century. It's a 33 horsepower harvester. And it takes 5 people to run it. And then there's you need a lot of land for growing the feed for the animals, and you need stable boys and so forth and so on. So it's a very big, difficult enterprise to get a 33 horsepower machine getting our food. Next. But here's a 200 horsepower, 7 times more horsepower, run by one person. Of course, there are people working in factories to make it and oil wells to produce fuel, but nevertheless, you can see the incredible impact that fossil fuel has on making humans productive. Labor productivity is more or less linearly proportional to the amount of energy that we use. To give you an idea of how important energy is in our society, economists say that energy is not important because it's only 5% or so of GDP. Its monetary value is so small that economists will tell you it's not important. And I say they got it completely ass backwards, because energy is important because it's cheap. It takes just one. If you can buy a barrel of oil for $100 or so, or less, a little bit less now, and it can do the work that a human, the physical work that a human could do in 2 years, which would cost you, let's say, $40,000 a year, $80,000. So that the energy is something like 8,000 times cheaper for the work it does than a human. Now, humans, of course, can do more specialized, higher quality work, perhaps, but anyway, it gives you an idea of what fossil fuel and oil in particular have allowed us to do. Now, this is just a summary of what I just said. Next. Now, where does petroleum come from? Okay, here's petroleum geology in 3 minutes. First of all, you need to have a geological period when there's extreme global warming. And the important reason for this is you have to heat the upper water columns in a lake or a coastal environment so that it doesn't mix to the bottom and it doesn't bring oxygen to the bottom, which means you have an anaerobic basin, as you have in East Africa now. Whoop, go back, please. And the important thing here is you get algae production in the surface waters that fall deep into an organic basin where they're not oxidized, and that's key. And for example, when Scotland went drifting off from Norway, it formed a trench like this, and a lake for a while, and then a marine embayment. And in that time, it was an anaerobic basin because the world was very warm at that time. And this was the origin of the great North Sea oil deposits. This basin, so you have to have a warm period with an anaerobic basin, such as a spreading trench in a rift next. And then you have to have a period of heavy rains that fill in the rift of sediment and pressure cook the organic debris for 100 million years or so. And then you get oil and gas next. And then some of that oil and gas tends to migrate up to the surface, where about 99% it is thought of the oil and gas is lost to the atmosphere. But some of it gets trapped in a reservoir. And you have water and oil and gas of different density in the reservoir, and that's an oil field. And the important thing about this is it was rare, relatively rare, for this to happen. So we can't expect to find oil just anywhere. We can find source rocks where the organics are formed, but they're generally very dilute and hard to extract any organic material that's there. So to get a good oil field, like the kind that's allowed our civilization, took some very rare conditions. Next. Pattern of use over time is, we attribute most of this to a guy named M. King Hubbert. And I think he might have been America's greatest scientist. I don't know. And he predicted peak oil for the United States in 1956. He predicted it to happen in 1970, which it did. That is, peak oil is the time of maximum production. Next. And this is called Hubbert's pimple. And just to give you an idea, all fossil fuels, including coal, in the period before and after when he was writing this in 1950, is just a little bitty time of a few hundred years that gives us what we think is what is our birthright, what is normal conditions. And just to, you see even the big invention of the steam engine on this scale. So what's the future going to be? And this was Hubbard's first prediction that the US oil, conventional oil, he said, would peak in about 1970, and it did. And everybody said, whoa. US just kept going on and imported oil. Next. And so depletion is real, it happened. And it's also, depletion is also happening as we mine out all of our minerals. This is the average grade of minerals. We used to mine 40% copper ore in Montana. Now we're mining something like 0.4%. So when you degrade minerals as you deplete the best stuff, because obviously you mine the best stuff first, the energy cost of getting a kilogram of pure copper goes up and up. And if we're going to talk about a brave new world of running on renewables, to do that would require a lot of copper. For example, there's 3 times more copper in present generation electric vehicles compared to internal combustion. So we have to think about depletion a lot. Next. Now, Hubbard's prediction, which is the yellow triangles here, was closely followed by the US production in the lower 48 up till around 2005. Now, the technological optimist says, oh, we'll always come up with some new technology, whatever it is. And in fact, this was true in the United States. They were right. Because next, what we came along is fracking, and this made a hell of a difference. Next. And this is the production of oil, which had peaked. They don't show, these are the official weekly estimates of oil production in the United States, which I look at every week. And peak in 1970 was about 12,000, which they don't show here. And it went down till 2008. But then fracking came along and up it went until COVID. So let's look at fracking. So will technology continue to bail us out? So here, look at all these huge areas for oil and gas where we can frack in the United States. So that looks like we're going to never run out of oil next in gas. But in fact, what we knew even as early as 2010 was that all this fracking comes from sweet spots where the big green circles are in Montrose County in North Dakota. And you know, there's frackable oil you can see around the periphery to the south and over into Montana. There are these little green circles that you can get oil from lots of places, but you don't get very much. And your energy return on investment is much lower. Next, and so what we've done in the sweet spots, all those patches are at half-mile intervals, are oil wells, oil and gas wells. And now we're doing what's called infill drilling. We're going in between the places we've already drilled, sort of robbing from Peter to pay Paul, because we've pretty much run out of sweet spots. Next. And the last 2 months of oil production has been flat, even though we are our big push to produce more oil and gas. We're drilling more, we're not getting more. So we don't quite know. Now, I want to spend the rest of my time talking about our new study. How much oil remains for the world to produce, comparing assessment methods and separating fact from fiction. This is a paper that's in Current Research in Environmental Sustainability. It's written by Jean Larrère, myself, and Roger Bentley, and I'm in very distinguished company here. Roger, I understand, is watching this, so I hope I don't embarrass him by getting it wrong. And Jean knows more about oil than I think anybody. He was head of exploration for the French company Total. He's a great graphic artist. You'll see some of it. And but his English is not great because it's French. And so that's where myself and Roger came in, except Roger has a great deal of experience in these matters as well. I'm just coming along as an editor, I suppose. A few thoughts. Okay, so let's take a look at our study. First of all, this is our use of oil. And it was exponential growth until 1970, when the first oil crisis happened in 79, the second oil crisis really set back the rate at which we were using oil. But it was increasing exponentially at 7.3% a year. And that was amazing. And now the increase is much less since then. And then you see the last point here is you're looking at a decline due to COVID. And that's a decline both in production in the field and a decline in use, because people use less oil with COVID. It made a big impact. These graphs are all by Jean Larrère, except for this one, which is from Matt Muschlach. And this is oil production. Now, this is really not quite oil, and we're going to talk about this because it's all liquids. We'll talk about that. And but the important thing is to look. People poo-poo peak oil. They say, well, that peak oil hasn't happened. Well, peak oil has happened for most of the world. It's happened for 6 of 8 continents and for something like 38 or 44 countries. And so we have Asia Pacific here, and these are plotted on top of each other. Africa, South and Central America, Mexico, which had a peak in 2004. Europe had a peak in 1999, and you can see the red has declined dramatically since the peak for UK. US conventional oil peaked in 1970, as I showed you, except we have the fracked oil, and so forth. Russia remains important, and the Middle East, of course, is extremely important. Then at the top, we have blue US natural gas liquids. That's not really oil, but people tend to add it in because, I don't know, so then kind of hides the fact that we're having a peak oil. And so the US tight oil is the final little triangle, brown triangle at the top. So the actual, well, I'll show you when the actual peak of real oil is, not including natural gas liquids, which was around 2005, and it's been flat since then. Next. Now, as I'm indicating, part of the problem is what is oil? So what's reported as oil increasingly is total liquids. Liquid, oily-like stuff, sort of which the purple is oil. Some of it is oil production. I mean, most of it is oil production. But then they're adding in what are called refinery processing gains, which means that we are learning increasingly how to make more gallons or liters of oil by expanding their volume, but this doesn't increase their energy content. So it's a little bit smoke and mirrors here. And feeding into this is conventional oil, which is crude oil, and increasingly they're including natural gas liquids, which tends to be propane and butane and propane and pentane and hexane and so forth. Now they're very useful, especially in the chemical industry, but they're not oil. And then we have what we call crude oil. Whoop, go back, please. What we call crude oil is normal crude oil, and also increasingly from the United States, essentially only a little bit from Argentina, is light tight oil, which is this fracked stuff. And then natural gas liquids, which comes out of, we're producing more natural gas. And when you take natural gas and reduce the pressure, then these light fractions come out. Now, then there's unconventional oil, and we have oil sands and extra heavy oil. Canada has a lot of that, and Venezuela. And then you can turn gas to liquids by using energy. You can turn coal to liquids by using energy, and so forth. And then you have biofuels. And I don't think much about biofuels because at least ethanol, which we're forced to put 10% into our cars in the United States, it takes a joule of energy from oil and gas to make a joule of alcohol that you put in your car. So that's not a source of energy. Okay, so keeping these in mind, this is all, I'm just showing what our paper does. Next. And so these are the official estimates of remaining oil that we have in our reserves, whatever reserves mean. And this is from British Petroleum, BP, different estimates, and from Energy Information Agency of the US and the Oil and Gas Journal, World Oil, and OPEC. Now, these are essentially, the question is, how are these derived? How do we get how much oil is remaining in reserves? And this is what our paper, the point our paper makes is that none of these are in any way vetted. They're not done in any professional manner. What happens is the Oil and Gas Journal calls each country of the 50 or so oil producers, well, 100 if you want to, well, 50 major oil producing countries. How much oil have you got? And they do this in December, early December. Well, you know, they don't know because they don't have their annual numbers until the beginning of January. I mean, they're still producing in December. And so Jean Larrey has assessed this in some detail, and they just mostly make up a number and give it to them. Very often for political reasons, very often because nobody wants to say that their reserves are depleting. So this is one of the main points of our paper with Roger and John. Next. And so how are these estimates obtained? Well, they're just crystal ball. They're not even crystal ball. They're political numbers very often. They're whatever number the country wishes to give us. And they're in no way vetted, and they're not corrected for the oil extracted in the last year. They're hogwash. Next. And the second big problem with how this oil is derived stems from the fact that there's 4 categories of oil. There's new oil, that's a new oil field. There's new pools in old fields. So you knew about East Texas, and then you found another big pool of oil off to the side. There's revisions. Oh, we didn't get it right in the past, so here's a revision. And there's extensions. Oh, we thought it was this big, but in fact it's that big. So usually larger. You get this by drilling. You drill another production well, and hey, there's more oil over here than we thought, or less. So the point is that revisions and extensions are usually 80 or 90% of new oil every year. And so what the Oil and Gas Journal and all the official sources, US EIA, etc., do, British Petroleum, do is they report the revisions and extensions of oil that was often found decades ago. They report it this year. So it looks like we're finding more oil. But in fact, that oil was found 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So let's take a look at what that means. Next. So this red line is the 4 lines I just showed you, is the official estimates of remaining oil. And that looks good. We're finding more and more oil. There's nothing to worry about. There's 50 years of reserves left, and it's increasing. So we don't have to worry about it. Well, in fact, if you take the revisions and extensions and move them over to the year in which the original oil field was found, which is what you should do, and you only include what's real oil, not the Venezuelan and Canadian tar sands, then you get the green curve, which reached the peak of reserves in about 1985 and has been declining since. So then instead of having 50 odd years of reserves, we only have about 25 years of reserves of real oil. So I think that's a pretty large finding. I mean, it's really Jean Larrey's finding of our paper. And I don't know why it doesn't get a lot more attention, but it doesn't. Okay, next. Oh, incidentally, go back one. Where do you get good estimates, probably from what are called scout companies. And the scout companies, you have to pay for it, provide data on how much oil is really there, and it's vetted and it's much more accurate. And John Larrea has been summarizing all of that. Now, there's other fake oil in here too that we consider political oil, like this big jump that took place when OPEC was fighting for quotas. All this is discussed in some detail in our paper. The point is, there's probably a lot less oil than the official numbers, and the reserves are declining, not increasing. Next. So the green line here is how the rate at which we found oil, greatest in 1948 when we found the largest oil field, Ghawar in Saudi Arabia. And the red line is our rate of using oil. And so the reserves, if you integrate the oil we found but did not produce, over in the middle of the graph, the difference between the integrated area between the red line and the green line, and then also independently integrate how much oil we use that we didn't find, i.e. integrate the area between the red line and the green line since 1985 or so, we're basically just sucking out our reserves. We're not finding oil nearly as fast as we're using it. We're not even finding it at 10% of the rate that we're using it. So this is quite different view of where we are with oil than the official view in the EIA oil and gas journal. Next. How about undiscovered oil? Well, we're going to find more oil. How much? Now, there's a quote unquote new tool. Hubbard not only came up with a way of looking at how oil is used over time, roughly a normal bell-shaped curve, but something called Hubbard linearization, which I got obsessed with a few years ago. Next. And this is Hubbard's original graph, and he said, if you extrapolate the line, and he has made up data points, these black points on here, of the change in the quantity each year over the total quantity, that ratio plotted against Q, that means the total amount of oil you're going to extract from a reservoir. The y-intercept is what he calls Q infinity. That's all the oil you're going to get out of that field or country or whatever it is that you're analyzing. And mathematically, I worried a lot about why is this, and you have the same units in the two sides of the graph and some of the mathematical issues. But when you look at it empirically, then what you find is, go ahead. Go ahead. Here's for example, Pennsylvania anthracite coal has been totally depleted. And so here's Hubbard linearization over the entire lifetime of the project. And you see from the midpoint, if you extrapolated, you would come within about 5% of the actual ultimate value of anthracite coal we got out of Pennsylvania. So this is the production on the left and the Hubbard linearization on the right. And you see for a resource that's completely exhausted, it worked pretty well. Next. This is for the East Texas oil field. Now, you might say that it didn't work perfectly. We read from the purple, we predicted 5,500, and well, I guess the ultimate was 5,500 if you look at the end of the brown line. This is our second largest oil field we ever found, East Texas. and it's completely exhausted, and the Hubbard linearization predicted it pretty well. So it's not perfect, but we think it works pretty well. Next. And
Charles,
so,
Charles,
10 minutes?
Yes, please.
Okay, I'll be done in 10. And so this is Brentfield. It over predicted the Brentfield a bit in England. Okay, next. So we use this for world oil. Okay, now what we're doing is going from lower right to lower left to upper right to upper left as more inclusive of what means oil. So this is real oil in the first one in lower left. I don't know if you can see my cursor. I don't think so, but where you see it's 2,500. This is our estimate of Hubbard linearization for pure oil. Yeah. Now go to the lower right, lower left. And if we add in fracked oil, we get about 500 billion barrels more. If we add in, now go up to the upper right, and if we add in what they used from all oil, which includes tar sands, we get another 500 and for our Hubbard linearization. And if we add in all liquids, which includes especially natural gas liquids, then we get up to 5,000. All of this compared to what we've used now, which is about 1,700. So you see how much oil we have left. We have far less than half of real oil. But if you want to throw in natural gas liquids and tar sands and stuff, which we barely are producing any, then you can get a lot more. Now, all of this next is summarized in our paper in a table. And so, for example, if you look where the red lettering is, the cumulative production to the end of 2020, now we've done another 200 since then, perhaps, but so it's 1,600 and we only have 900 left to produce. We're using up our real oil really fast. But this is in our publication, which is available from Art or me, and you can look at this in more detail. But you know, there's not an awful lot that we can find of fracked oil or extra heavy that we're likely to produce in the world. The most important oil is the oil that we've already taken out. And there's not a whole lot of that left. Next, okay, implications. Oh, and here's Jean's fitting of a Hubbard curve of the purple line is the real oil, which you see has been flat since 2005. It's recovered a little bit since, no, I'm sorry, the upper purple line, go up, over there. Okay, that's empirical. That's real oil production. And if you want to add in the fracked oil, you get the blue line a little bit above that. And if you want to add in the extra heavy, that's the Canadian and Alberta oil, you go up a little bit. And if you want to add in natural gas liquids, which isn't oil at all, it's stuff like propane, then you can get a lot more. And that's what we've been sold as is oil in the press, which is obviously a lot more than the real stuff, which is down at the purple line. And these are projections. The dotted lines going over to the left are projections, which are dropping quite rapidly. In and they're constrained by the totals that we find using Hubbard linearization. Next. Now, there's a lot of sensitivity analysis, and Stephen Moore and colleagues did in these three graphs a low, which to me is the most accurate, medium, and high estimates of all fossil fuels. So if you don't like what we did, you can choose one of these other things, and it'll move the peak of oil a little bit to the left, not very much, not even as far as 2050 at all for, I guess that's, let's see, which is oil? I'm sorry, the blue is coal. And anyway, you'd have to look at that in some detail, but no matter how you cut the cake, the next generation is going to have to deal with the downside of all fossil fuels by any stretch of the imagination. By the next generation, as I mean my grandchildren, except I don't have any, but the grandchildren of you old people watching this, they're going to have to deal with the downside of all fossil fuels. And I think that's going to make a hell of a big difference to whatever sustainability means, including the transition to whatever else we may or may not be able to do. Okay, next. What does it mean? Well, very complex, but I'm going to try to say this very briefly and simply. Next. There you go. And of course, everything we're doing is trying to increase the economy, which means we're drinking our beer or oil quicker. So the issue of economics and growth and all of that Herman Daly and others deal with it. Okay, so there's all of that. We're trying to drain our glass as fast as we can. Next. And here's an idea who has the remaining oil. This is real oil, so otherwise Canada would be bigger. And I don't know whether Venezuela, looks like they're including their tar sands. So, you know, Russia is beating its chest these days. Next. Declining energy return on investment, that's my thing. It's what I'm a little bit famous for. And the important thing about it, now we've been talking about this. I was on the first page of the Wall Street Journal with declining energy return on investment. And in February 1981. So the economist says, oh, you don't have to worry about depletion because the increased prices will bring in increasingly less economic resources, but they'll be there. Yeah, you can bring them in, but at some point the energy cost is greater than the energy gain from whatever you're exploiting. And we may be reaching this, well, Canadian, most of what we built was built, of our society is built on 20-to-1 energy return on investment. Now, Canadian oil is something like 4-to-1. This is tar sand for the good stuff, and I don't know what the bad stuff will be. I have a grad student on his committee, Charles Guaybaco. Okay, I don't pronounce that well. Sorry, Charles. That's working on that. We'll know more about it in time. So next, the important things are worked out by, I think, Nafeez Ahmed. This is a great little book, well worth the $55 it costs. And biophysical triggers of political violence. And how we see that today, next, is inflation. You know, it costs more to get oil, it costs more to get copper. And what do we see that as? We see that as inflation. And that's a killer in England's economics and US economics. And my God, the fate of our next elections depends upon the fact that people don't understand what the hell's going on with inflation. Inflation is happening because we've used up the best oil. Hey, folks, that's the way it is. Next. Final thing is that this is work I did about 20 years ago. If you look at, here's the world and the economy within it, and we call this the cheese slicer diagram. Just think of cheese, Velveeta, as something coming out of the economy. That's GDP. The economy produces GDP, which is used in only two ways, essentially. It's used for investments or consumption. Now, what we like is the red stuff, discretionary. Discretionary investments, you know, new ski lodge, or discretionary consumption, going to a movie. Staples is what you need, food, shelter, clothing. And you also have to do infrastructure maintenance, that comes out of investments, that's the light blue. And you have to invest into energy. Now, this is data that we did for 1949. Next. 1970, that was the last year before the oil started getting expensive. Discretionary arrows are pretty big. Next, this is data. 1981, you see the red discretionary arrows have become a lot smaller because that blue going into getting the more expensive oil after the oil prices after the United States peaked, the oil was more expensive. And it came out of discretionary spending. Next, then things relaxed to 1990, and red arrows got bigger again. Next, and 2007, pretty good still. Red arrows are big, but this is what we predicted back in 2008, and in fact, this is what's happening now. Next. You see the investments that are required going to get energy get larger and larger, take more of the GDP, leaving less for discretionary. So people see this as inflation. Next, and we projected that to 1950, our discretionary spending becomes very, very small as we have to take a great deal more of our investments going into this. Now, all of this is not captured in any conventional economics. Biophysical economics captures this, and I think it's going to dominate our future. Next. So my main final professional goal is to push this barely balanced rock of neoclassical economics off the cliff and replace it with biophysical economics. But that's another lecture. Next. And I'm done. Not quite an hour.
Thank you very much, Charles. I'm not surprised that the government in Canada doesn't drink beer and doesn't understand about draining a glass or an oil well. But I am a little bit surprised that the government of the United States, which I know has done energy systems analysis amongst many other things, has not done that. But let me please turn to John Legg, if you kindly open your mic.
That is absolutely wrong, because the energy analysis done in the United States is done by economists, and they don't have any flipping idea what they're talking about.
In my day, you had a very good energy systems analyst in Washington, but that person has probably gone the way of the dodo, like his partner in Canada. So let me pass to John Legg, please, for an initial question or comment, and invite anybody who'd like to speak to put their comments or their question in the chat box, so I know how to come to you. And following John Legg, it will be John Meyer. Please, John.
Thank you, John. Boy, we have an excess of Johns here. But anyway, if I may call you Charlie, because I'm a 10 or 15 years your senior, it's just a fascinating presentation you've given us. And I wrote down my question immediately because in your, and by the way, everything else lived up to that first slide, which gave a broad introduction of what you'd be doing. When you said in your beginning slide that a certain amount, and I forget the exact wording, but the important wording was that oil, and you didn't specify the amount, I presume it was a significant amount, is going to be left in the ground. Well, immediately this means a political question with a big P, because now a lot, and here I'm going to ask for your general comments. Let's just say, going to your last fascinating evolving graph, which you said none of that is really captured in the traditional graphs of today. But you can see from those colors, and as you mentioned yourself, the discretionary, the two arrows, the consumption and the investment, were getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And of course, the larger amount being put into investments to get more. Anyway, let's just say, I had no idea because I don't work in this area, but how much of the future political wrangling can you actually see from all your study? And here I'm referring to the chief, the kleptocrat in chief, the honorable, well, he's not honorable, the fellow who started on February 24, the war. I mean, if you're dealing with thugs like that, and then you deal with OPEC, and as we know, Putin, is included, I assume, in the OPEC plus. It just seems to me that there's a natural tendency for so many oil producing or having countries to not want to be stuck with too much oil caught in the ground. And so if you could give your general comments, but how do these decision makers, let's say Saudi Arabia, where I'm not that interested in Putin because he's simply a thug and he's very good at that, but how do the OPEC people control this tendency to want to get as much as they can now compared to what they know if they operate only in that regard, how less and less they'll have in the future. Anyway, there's you. I'm sorry for such a broad question, but it's because it's like opening a door. You've opened the door to a whole new area, probably to a lot of us, certainly to me. Can you comment on this, the politics of the future when it comes to oil?
How can we get the recording of this in the hands of politicians, huh?
Yes.
That'd be interesting.
Yes.
Well, first of all, when I look at the unfortunate pictures of what's going on in Ukraine, all I can think of is all the embodied energy that's being blasted to smithereens. And will they ever rebuild that infrastructure in Ukraine? And at what cost? And, you know, so, and we could do it with the Marshall Plan at the end of World War II, because we had lots of cheap oil, and now it's a different situation. So, and I don't think that Russia's going to give the oil to Ukraine to rebuild their country. There's all kinds of things that come into the equation of how fast the oil is taken out of the ground, but you got to pay first respects to the oil engineers in the field, because if you take it too fast, it's like compacting an aquifer. You'll destroy the structures, and they know how to do it. So you can take oil out of an oil field only so fast. And so how fast you want to do it economically, well, it does seem like OPEC has finally figured out that it's not a good thing to try to drown the world in oil, because if they let it out a little bit more slowly, now that the rest of the world's production is everywhere is declining, they can pretty much sell their oil for more money, which is, I guess, what they want to do. And so I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but those are thoughts that your question brought up in my mind. And if you're satisfied, we'll go on to the next person. But if you're not, or you can email me and I'll try to do a better job.
Well, it's a very small one.
John,
Okay, no,
John,
sorry,
can I
John.
pass on? I'll come back to you if I have time.
Yeah, good.
John Meyer, to be followed by Bill Reese, please. John?
Yeah, Charlie, for thousands of years, most of humanity's existence, we looked at the world through a biophysical lens. It's only in the last few centuries that we've allowed ourselves to be constrained by money, and only in the last 7 or 8 decades that we've allowed the GDP metric to control a great deal of national policy. And these, of course, are both money and GDP are subsets of the biophysical world. You've got a biophysical economics institute that you've set up with a group of prominent individuals. And I wonder if you could comment on what you see as a difference between commercial economics. And I think we need to use the term. Anyone who says economists, I think we need to say, well, what kind of economist? Is it a money economist, a commercial economist, a labor economist, an energy economist, a biophysical economist? So we shouldn't allow people to use a generic term of economist anymore without challenging them. Anyway, can you differentiate for us your thoughts on the difference between a biophysical economics world and that of our current commercial economics world, that lens?
Well, I'm trained as a natural scientist, as a systems ecologist. And when I first started studying economics, I said, well, this violates in all kinds of ways what we know we can't violate: laws of thermodynamics and laws of material and so forth and so on. And Herman Daly set that out, Howard Odum set that out, and we have it very succinctly in a 1981 paper. It's just bullshit, and it's the difference between bullshit and reality. The only way I know how to find out how things really work is through natural science, the scientific method, and this is simply not used within conventional economics. They call it a social science, but it isn't even social science. And this has been all laid out by Jurdiska Rogan and Herman Daly, myself, and Bill Reese a bit, and so forth. So it's all, I think it's your toilet training. The way that you're toilet trained as a natural scientist is very rigorous and requires you never to violate the laws of thermodynamics, et cetera, et cetera. And this simply is not part of the training of conventional economics. And what they do in their very most basic firms and household model is violate all kinds of basic scientific principles. And so I don't know what you can do about it. Now, how do they get away with it? Because we pump more oil out of the ground every year. So have whatever fantasy world you want to come up with, you can pump more oil out of the ground and make it work until you can't pump more oil out of the ground, which is about where we are now. And certainly will be very soon in the future. And so, am I answering your question, or am I on a rampage?
Yeah, no, that's good. You answered it, and I just have to say that we do commercial economics. It might be bullshit, but it's very profitable bullshit for a certain group of people.
A certain
So,
group, yeah.
Thanks. Okay.
The right word to use is neoclassical, I suppose.
Yeah.
Neoclassical economics, but I say conventional economics. I mean, commercial economics, you know, things like doing accounting and so forth, at least a good one is honest. But a dollar bill should say pay to the bearer 5 megajoules of energy work. Because money only has meaning because it has energy to back it up. It's not backed up by gold. When they brought gold back from the New World to the Old World in the 1500s, they doubled its quantity and halved its value, because the value came from the work of the sun and the forests and the crops and the sheep and so forth, the energy that was used in Europe doing the actual production.
Okay. Good stuff. Thanks.
Gordon Kubinik, sorry. Gordon, you'll be following Bill Reese. Bill Reese, please take the floor.
Hi, Bill.
Thank you very much. Hi, Charlie. Great to see you again. Sorry, there's a couple of budgie birds flying around here that I'm still babysitting for a friend, so if the noise disturbs, I apologize. Listen, mainstream or neoliberal economic models contain zero information about biophysical systems or even a social system with which the economy interacts in the real world. So it's complete fantasy to expect economists to say anything useful about such things as climate change or species loss or, you know, oil depletion. I mean, for heaven's sake, the Nobel Prize was awarded to an economist who said that we don't worry about climate change because it would only destroy agriculture. And since agriculture is only 3% of the GDP, who cares? We can grow through that in less than 2 years. So it's that kind of thinking that dominates at the top. So I think you're absolutely right in your assessment of that. I have a question. Technological optimists, including Nafeez Ahmed, whom you quoted earlier, who's now made a complete U-turn, would argue that it's a rosy, technologically bright future, that wind and solar power will quantitatively replace the fossil fuels. So let's just get on with life and stop all this worry. What do you say to that?
Well, you know, I just bought a high-end heat exchanger, and I'm having panels installed on my roof, and you know, I'm relatively affluent. I mean, not by the standards of affluence, but by the standards of people of the world, and it took out all my capital, and it was damn expensive, even with all of the subsidies. And I can't imagine a poor, you know, 90% of the people in the world doing anything like this. And this has been analyzed best by, in my opinion, the people in Spain, Kaplan Perez, and so forth. And if anybody wants, you can write me and I'll send you their papers, or you can ask them. But the energy return on investment, if and as we go to 50 or 100% solar, is going to fall below levels that I think can support modern society. And I think what Nafeez Ahmed has in this book said accurately is that when when a country, Syria, Egypt, whatever, discovers oil, they grow their families, they grow their economy, they grow their infrastructure, and you go over the hump, and everybody's expecting this growth is normal. and it's what's owed to them, and then you don't do it. So if we transition to renewables, then that graph of the final graphs I showed of the investment arrow has to be huge, going up to getting whatever it is that we need to do the transition. And that's going to be, I don't think we can do it. And I don't think there's enough copper, and I don't think there's enough cobalt and whatever else we need to do it. Neodymium, I don't know. But the energy cost of all these things is going to be enormous. And we should have Canadian and American institutes with, 100 really good people, well-funded and well-vetted people doing peer-reviewed science to try to figure out whether this is possible. And I mean, the problem I have as an ecologist is I don't know whether I want us to succeed, because even if we can make energy supplies that have no impact, it's what happens at the other end of the wires, that we transform the earth into what we want and to systems that are very unreliable. So it's very complicated. And I see Jack Albert here, and Jack's got the only solution, which is enormous reduction in the number of people. And we don't even talk about that because it's not politically correct. And I don't know what would happen if I was still a professor. I remember a student coming up to me asking me whether I had tenure. And I said, yeah, I have tenure. Why do you ask? And he says, because you're so politically incorrect, and I love it. And I don't know if we can allow this. We can't allow a discussion of a reduction in population, let alone a reduction of affluence. And that's what we need to do. Otherwise, I don't think we can do it at all. It's absolutely impossible. I like your birds though, Bill.
No, thanks, Charlie. By the way, I agree utterly with everything you just said. That's the answer I was hoping you would respond to. Thank you.
We have to reduce our footprint. I hope everybody knows it.
Yeah.
Knows
That's
it, Bill.
population and consumption.
Population and our affluence, right? Right on.
Thank you, William Rees, for the Twitter, the right kind of Twitter. Gordon Kubanek, you're on now, and Ruben Nelson, please be ready to follow Gordon.
Right, thank you very much. My question is pretty simple. I've been a teacher most of my life, and what I've discovered, if I present truth in too harsh a fashion, nobody listens to me. They just consider me too negative and turn off. So my question is, how do I discuss and recommend a course of action for my children and grandchildren, given the reality that you've described? How can they best prepare for this reality?
Well, I've had a great life with no children and a very modest affluence. And when I die, it'll stop. Now, I don't know if, I didn't say no sex. And I don't say to your children, to your students that. I don't know, I've got to talk day after tomorrow. I got to talk to 8th graders. So I got to figure this out. I never worry. I'm a scientist, and I never worried about policy, in which my students used to tell me was a cop-out. Okay, it's a cop-out. So quite frankly, I don't think there's a damn thing we're going to do. And I think the best thing we need to do is understand what's happening, like understand where inflation's coming from. So that otherwise countries will become impossible to rule, as is happening in Haiti right now. So I don't have a good answer to you. I think you tell them what the way it is, and then you say, well, we got to adjust to that. It doesn't mean you can't have a happy life, just means that it won't be based on ever increasing affluence for everybody. That's what I think, but I hope maybe that you can get somebody that'll come in here and give a good answer to Gordon. Well, Gordon, I've failed you. I
Well, I
don't know how to
failed
answer.
too. Whenever I try to even bring forth a conversation like that, I have people just turn off, and they don't want to hear even discussing, even just saying this is it. They won't even. They just walk away because it's too harsh. They actually quite quickly recognize. Well, what I get told is, all you're telling me is that I'm screwed, and that's not the answer I want to hear.
Well, are you a Canadian?
Yes, but I've lived in the States a lot, so I get the
No, we'll
American
count you as a Canadian.
Yeah.
If you want to develop your tar sands and use it only for Canada, then you can have a good life and with growth and affluence and toys and everything for quite a long time. You want to do that?
I don't see, in terms of the EROI, I don't see that working. And in terms of
Oh, it's 4-1. It's you can limp along on that.
yeah. Once again, being a Club of Rome person, I don't see the greenhouse effect being so catastrophic. For example, we'll end up with 50 million Americans crossing our borders because you can't live in Alabama or Florida anymore. So I don't, they're going to want to live up here, and they have more guns than we do. So there's nothing we can do about it, right?
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a problem. I recommend shooting them at the border.
Okay, Ruben Nelson, you're next up, and you'll be followed by Carlos Rossi. Ruben.
Charlie, thank you both for your life's work and for this presentation. I'm deeply interested in policy. I'm also an Albertan, and will tell you that there are politicians here who would be happy to take your advice, would even saw off Alberta from the rest of Canada and keep what we have. And we have one of the few places in the world that is not largely infested by rats. We have a rat patrol that patrols the Montana-Saskatchewan border, and they would be happy to turn that into an armed patrol to keep other people out. Just so one possible scenario you can watch from Montana or wherever you happen to be.
Well, we can't even keep the Venezuelans out of the U.S. I see a Venezuelan pop up here, so it's not easy.
Well, I'm also waiting for the governor of Texas, who is smart and devious enough to ship unwanted people to Washington to figure out that actually he'd cause far less trouble if he just flew them to Calgary. Anyway, my question is this.
They don't want to go where it's that cold.
It relates to policy. I have followed the conversation that I characterize as the conversation of cultural crisis and transformation for most of my life. And one of the things that intrigues me about it, and that what you've done is it fits within that. It's a subset within that wider conversation that we who are modern techno-industrial people have no long-term future as modern techno-industrial people. That one way or another, there will be we will lose complexity because we don't have the energy to keep the complexity we've got. And that's just another phrase for societal collapse. And we don't know whether it'll be well managed or just thrust upon us. My question is, do you know of any places that are seriously established? And by that, I mean a National Science Council, a major foundation, senior government bureaucrats, even a single university that gets this, not just 2 or 3 people in it, or even a dozen, but that as an institution. I know of no institution in the world that I would consider significant, and I mean that by larger than a philosophy department. You've talked of 100 staff, let's go with that, that actually takes this point of view seriously. Do you know of any?
No.
Okay, that's that. Thank you. It's not the answer I hoped for, but I keep wondering. Do you have
we have our Biophysical Economics Institute, and I see Phil Metz, I saw him somewhere on, he's a member of that, and but that might be at most 10 people.
Sure. Yes.
And we had a International Society of Biophysical Economics, which is at the moment moribund, but and there was 100 people that were totally into it, but they were scattered all around the world. No, I can't even think of. There's hippie communities that sort of believe this kind of thing, and we have one here in Southern Oregon, and I don't know, but not much. No.
Okay. Thank you. If I hear of something, I will let you know. Cheers.
We have almost run out of our hour and a half to keep the speaker completely on the hook. So I will go to one final questioner while we're still recording. It's Carlos Rossi, and I will invite Ted and Peggy to continue on after the recording's been turned off. And if our speaker is kind enough to keep chatting with you, it will be done on an unrecorded, totally informal basis. So Peggy, Carlos Rossi, please.
Hello, Charlie.
Hi, Carlos.
Great to see you. It's been a long time. A great presentation, by the way. I'll keep my question fast. What is your best estimate for Android, for total Android for the world right now?
EROI?
Android.
Sorry, that's how I pronounce it. Since I invented it, sort of, I can define how it should be said. EROI for the world, 20 to 1, 15 to 1 to 20 to 1, mostly on the remaining good oil and gas. Gas can be pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
Coal can be pretty good, but the good coal is gone too. But somewhere around there, 15 to 20 to 1 is a guess. And going down.
Okay.
And this is done by actually 3 different techniques. A couple of French people did it using dollars. I do it using energy for energy directly. They do it using dollars and complicated things. Let's see, it's I'm having a senior moment. I can't come up with it. And an Italian guy did it using CO2 estimates, and the numbers all came out more or less the same society-wide as around 15 or so to 1. So that's probably a pretty good estimate.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
And I'm halfway through your chapter 18.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to send you another chapter 15, but I'll tell you later. Okay. With more graphs.
Charles Hall is a systems ecologist, and I'm very pleased to say that amongst our KCOR members, we have an ecologist to thank him formally on our behalf. Over to David Doherty, please.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Charlie. That was amazing. I think that Professor Odom would absolutely be thrilled to see the way that you pulled together all these facts from various places and synthesized them into something that was comprehensible and comprehensive. So I want to thank you very much. I hope perhaps in future you'll consider both continuing to attend our sessions and perhaps to give us another. I'm going to turn on our end slide here. I'd like to thank everybody who attended this week's session for coming. I hope you enjoyed it. would encourage you to visit our website. If you wish to register for Stay Informed, you'll get a weekly email that'll tell you everything that has happened during the week. If you wish to join, your contribution is actually eligible for a tax receipt in Canada, because we're a registered Canadian charity trying to inform people about what is happening in our world. So I hope anybody who has seen this on YouTube will continue to watch our videos and hit the subscribe button. We'd love to see you again. Thank you very much to John as well, and we'll see you again next time.